So, have you come for a tale of blood-curdling spatter, betrayal, lust? Well, sorry. Welcome to the COM300 module on narrative criticism. Our objectives: to summarize the key elements of the narrative paradigm and why it's different from the rational world paradigm, to distinguish narratives from other forms of communication and how narratives uniquely kind of create a sense of personal involvement, to explore the elements of narrative and apply these elements to analyze and to evaluate narratives using criterion like narrative fidelity and narrative coherence. The working vocabulary can kind of help you keep track of all of those. The rational world paradigm is a world where humans make decisions based on evidence and reasoning, and that they have judgments that are rational and based on knowledge and kind of puzzling through the issues, evaluating the evidence. The evidence is often appropriate to a forum like a science, a public policy issue, a religious issue, etc. The narrative paradigm, which is conceived by Walter Fisher, situates humans as evaluating the stories that are told, and whether the stories offer good, compelling reasons to believe one thing or another. Many public policy issues like immigration or healthcare or climate change are not as much about evidence per se as they are about how believable and consistent the story is being told. So when we start asking questions like, is this a coherent story? Is this story sound true to us? Then we're really getting at how do we make decisions on some of these issues in our society. So the narrative paradigm says, look, even if you're an ordinary citizen and not an expert, not someone trained in scientific reasoning and scientific data, even if you're an ordinary person, you still know stories. You still can evaluate whether or not a story rings true, a story is coherent or contradictory in places. You've got a built-in BS detector because you've been listening to stories all your life and making judgments about them. All right, so then what constitutes a story? Foss gives us criterion to say, well, this is something that a story is, and if it's not that, then it's something else. And it has to have at least two events, two different things going on. They are usually organized by time, so that one occurs after another, or there's a sequence or something that's relevant. Third, importantly, there has to be some kind of causal or contributing relationship among the events. So you can say the king died and the queen died. Well, there's no story there. There's nothing connecting that. But if you say the king died and the queen died of grief, well, then you have a story. You have a connection, a reason between the two events. And so there has to be some kind of unified subject. You know, if I say telephone book, lamp, van, there's no unification there. But if I put it all together and weave relationships among them, then it becomes more of a unified subject, and that's what we call a narrative. Narratives create personal involvement by being more particular, more specific, more detailed. There's imagery there that we often don't get in some of the other forms of rhetoric and communication. Narratives are shareable. I can download them, I can post them, I can tell them, more importantly, perhaps even show them. And narratives involve a level of personal evaluation. When you hear a story, you're often thinking kind of, what's the point? Or does the point really have power for me? And so that's kind of the moral evaluation at some level that's implicit in a lot of stories. There's a long list of objectives of narrative. And Foss gives you on page 326, 327. So stories do a lot of things, and they encourage action, they comfort people, they inspire, they entertain. There's a whole list. let's look at the examples. If you read The Little Boy Who Cried Wolf to your children, well, you're teaching or instructing them about something. You're socializing them into a community. They should not cry false alarm. And you're conveying certain truths and values there about things that you do or do not do. And of course, if you do that wrongly in the community, then they turn their back on you, and they will not come to your aid when you've cried false alarm too many times. And if you're sharing about a bad teacher or a nightmare class that you've had and you're just blowing steam, there's a sense of healing from loss or disappointment or anger about something. And it also is an opportunity to comfort someone and even bring relief, to share the misery and say, if you think that's bad, here's what I've got, right? So. If you tell an orientation group that you were part of a high school theater club and you did plays and so forth, what that story you're talking is they're basically gonna construct identity for you as you find out, you move into the college or the institution and you're being oriented. It also can help maintain or create a sense of community. You can find like-minded people, right, through that kind of story. So those are some of the functions, right? Not a complete list, but features of the narrative. Foss lists a number of these, and we're just going to go through the basic ones. Setting helps, where the story is, helps create mood, maybe some expectation of what's going to happen. Is it a dark city at night with jazz playing? Then that's likely a crime drama from the 1970s. Is there a change in setting that drives events that happen? Is it a race across the country? Is it a series of different challenges and so forth? And is the scene very specific? Is it a very clear location somewhere, or is it somewhere generally? A room with a couch, so how specific is the setting? The characters then are obviously varied, and so the roles that characters play include protagonist, antagonist, comic relief, the innocent victim, the buddy who provides motivation, and they can be developed in terms of complexity, if they're a round, developed, complex character, or if they're just flat. Right at the beginning of the Star Wars story, number 4, Darth Vader is absolutely flat. He's just an evil villain, and by the time we get to the last of the sequence, number 6, he's developed some complexity, some guilt, some love, and he's become a little bit more rounder of a character, right? Traits and flaws, if you're a genius, if you're a bully, if you're a traitor, if you grow or you don't, you fail. All of these are kind of things that characters do that have meaning and importance in stories. The narrator, who's telling the story? Sorry. Is it a direct story? You're just watching it unfold. No one's telling it. And if the narrator is speaking, is it an objective voice or is it a subjective voice, one of the characters in the story? Objective might be like a football announcer, they cross the 34-yard line, whatever. But a subjective voice might be someone like Red in the Shawshank Redemption, right, where he is kind of telling the story. He has a little bit of an omniscient, he's looking at a lot of things, but then by the end, he's living the story, you're watching him, and he doesn't know what's going to happen. So there's a narrator who has overarching knowledge, but then suddenly doesn't as part of the story. They're more subjective. What's the power of the narrator? Are they the authority? Are they the source of wisdom? Or are they unreliable? Are they being deceptive? Are they deceiving you? Are they in fact the murderer telling you about the mystery, right? So narrators can play different roles that way. events or plot structure, obviously there's some major things that happen. We call those kernels. If you take them away, then the story, doesn't really function the way it does. Satellites are kind of minor events. They're often color, side stories, maybe distraction. But the difference is, Batman has a Batmobile that has a jet engine. Wow, that's cool, but it's a satellite. It's not something really important. Batman watches his parents die, killed by a criminal. Well, that's a critical part of the Batman lore and the development of his character as a vigilante, right? So sometimes a story has a complex weave of many storylines, political thriller going across 5 or 6 different locations in the world, and all of the action is building to climax, and some storylines are just very simple, very straightforward, very narrative-like. Forrest Gump, I'm just kind of following this perspective on this fellow. There's not a lot of side plots. It's basically what's happening to him through his life, right? Then Hollywood, there's a whole set of doctrines about what makes a blockbuster movie, and so there's all these basic plot points that they look for, and they chart out, by the 8th minute, this needs to have happened, and so forth. It's kind of interesting to chart that against the blockbusters. But so you get plot points like, the gauntlet, or the first test, which the protagonist probably fails or doesn't do very well at. And exile, where you're sent out or cast away from where you are. Lots of different options for looking at what the plot is and how that gives the point, or the at least some of the value or the function, the healing, the entertainment of the story. Other factors, other than those basic 4, include how time plays out, the use of time to create perspectives. Is the story told as a flashback, like Stand By Me, 4 boys go to look at a dead body? Is it told flash forwards, where you're looking at future, Terminator, sort of, here's what's happening in the future, kind of a thing? Is the story told very quickly, or is it told with long, kind of drawn out sequences, right? All of that has to do with the pacing. Is it real time, like the show 24? Is it happening minute by minute just as you're watching it? Or is it set in a specific era? Is it, we're in Elizabethan England, or we're in 1950s Baltimore? So the other thing that's happened recently in cinema is the fracturing of time. We see Memento, where the first thing you see is the last thing that happens. And we see something like Vantage Point, an assassination told over and over again from different viewpoints at the same time period, as more of the plot and the resolution unfolds. Okay, so other than time, cause is a really important part of narratives. The cause and effect relationship is sometimes made very clear about something, like the movie Crash, right? There's a lot of stuff that are kind of around this crash that happens, right? The events or behaviors and choices that people make often define outcomes. It's the difference between comedy and a tragedy, okay? So if I make a choice or do something that's a tragic choice, then I am almost inexorably impelled forward into the implications. The movie In Bruges, one of the assassins, so the hitman, kills a child early in the movie, and from that point on, you kind of know that the narrative flow is going to provide closure to that particular incident, to cause the evolution of the situation. Theme is important because you can illustrate sort of a general running idea through a narrative. Time is often a theme. It's in the movie Run Lola Run. You see the run 3 times, but you also see time as a motif. And there's a movie 11:14 where something critical happens at that time, and you'll flip back and forth across time, but then you'll see a clock on the wall and it'll say 11:20, and you know that it just happened, or it'll say 11:10, and you know, oh, it's about to happen in 4 minutes. Right, so theme that way. A musical theme like the Lord of the Rings, anytime you see the influence of the One Ring, right, then you get this kind of eerie little da-da, right, and so that's a musical motif that repeats over the course of the story. Finally, the type of narrative. Fry talks about comedy, and then there's romance, and there's tragedy, and there's irony. We also look at different narratives in terms of journeys or quests or puzzles, so there's a variety of ways that we can typecast stories. How do we assess the story? Well, we look at the objectives, we look at the functions, and is it kind of doing that, and how are truths or values embedded in the movie? And that's an interesting question. But you can also look to see whether or not it meets a couple of standards that I look for in any analysis of narrative. And these standards are fidelity, which is, does it have truth quality? Does it ring true to me? It may be a science fiction story set on a planet somewhere or in space, but I'm watching people react to an alien going through the ship and killing them, and I'm still kind of asking, is this believable? Would a person act that way under this stress? So that's kind of fidelity, that question. Coherence is a different standard. Coherence asks, does the story hold together as a whole? Is it consistent? Does it contradict itself in different places? And so that idea of, are the characters kind of consistent, or do they start suddenly acting very differently? Are the events, are they going to hang together? The movie Joe versus the Volcano, Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan, but in the end they get thrown out of a volcano with lava and end bobbing in the water with their luggage, and at some point you just kind of go, I can't even go there, right? So there's a lack of coherence and a lack of reality through that. The next thing is the Hess, looking at public memory, and this is a study of ludology. Ludology is the study of computer games and the gaming culture to understand the role of digital technologies. And so what's happening here is this is an immersive kind of first-person shooter, and this is the game Medal of Honor: Rising Sun. It starts with the Pearl Harbor attack, and then the rest of it is there's kind of an overarching meta-narrative that is nationalistic revenge against the Japanese and pride in our nation and responding. They use veteran interviews, they use letters from home written by veterans, and they kind of create this historical sense of being there, of public memory about the war. Right? The personal narrative in the story, Griffin searches for his brother who has been kidnapped, and the Japanese enemies are ruthless and are torturing and so forth. And the narrative constructs itself as the player. You're doing the first person shooting. Yourself as a soldier. You're running and rescuing and running missions. And then self as a nation, where you're responding to the dastardly Japanese attack. Right? He argues that it becomes almost like a museum. When you clear a level, you can take a tour of the facilities and so forth. And that the implications is that this is a story that's been rendered really about historical and personal vengeance. Our self, the American, as morally and technologically superior, as heroic, as nationalistic, and often kind of framed within that whole distinctive culture of violence and the first-person shooting and everything. So it can be very selective to have public memory spurred by a first-person shooter video game, and that's kind of Hess's point. So in Gilmore's analysis, what are the narrative elements he identifies? Do you agree with his conclusions and the impact? So post this. What stories do you remember from your childhood? And how do you think those stories that are told to children all over the country and the world, How do you think they function in our culture? Perhaps not a blood-curdling tale of betrayal and lust, but nonetheless an interesting story about the importance of rhetoric in the way that we humans live our lives. Have a great day.